Very good, thanks. It's really a pleasure to be here. For those of you that don't know me, this is my third year here at class, and it's really fabulous to be able to call this place home and to see how rich a history it has. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about technology. It's a different kind of a story than what Ben was talking about, but I think it's going to reach across some of the questions of the public sphere and what that means today. Shall I close that one too? There we go. Okay, so I'd like to start with a story first. A hot day ended with a cold beer after putting my son to bed. With him asleep, I relaxed in the peace afterwards, melting into my phone and my Facebook feed. Plenty had happened that day while I'd been busy. The world continued on its social voyage. But between the images of people's dinner and graceless humble brags, a video appeared. Starkly, it was there, staring back at me. A man, gasping, recently shot and dying on the street, surrounded by others. One of those people hovered a camera over his face while he died. The person holding that camera was a Brazilian police officer. This police officer had filmed and uploaded his own violence, placing it on Facebook for all to see. The video began with a clamoring of unclear words. The camera quickly focused on a young man's yellowing face, his mouth agape, his eyes open and staring up at the sky. A chest-sized red Abercrombie and Finch logo emblazoned across his gray-hooded sweatshirt. Then, a clear voice breaks the relative silence. "You're going to be famous, you thief, dying here." Seconds later, a second victim, slightly out of the picture, lying beside the first, manages to utter a little more than 2 words. "My children." Then a third voice from the background. "This piece of shit won't die, man." Again, the clear voice. "Are you going to take a long time to die? Damn it." Beyond the stark imagery, the page on which the video was posted also displayed a series of photos from the scene. Now obviously a police shooting on the west side of the city of Sao Paulo, Brazil. The photos capture the police cars, as well as the faces and precinct numbers of the police officers involved in the shooting. Alongside the video are a series of comments that seem to alternate between hopeful questions like, "Did he die?" to assertions like, "Burn in hell, I like it when they suffer, and congratulations on a job well done." By the time I took a screenshot of it, the video had been shared more than 700 times. In the hours that followed, I watched as discussion of the video exploded into the public sphere, first in traditional newspaper reports, and eventually in a statement from Sao Paulo's public security secretary. But before the image could produce substantive political and public momentum about police violence, it disappeared. It was moderated from afar, deleted by Facebook. So why does this really matter? Today I'd like to discuss some ideas I'm grappling with around these questions, especially as they concern the mode of production that now surrounds all of us, technological capitalism, and its local effects in Latin America. This new mode of production and accumulation is premised on data as the world's newest commodity, fixed and mined and extracted from handheld devices, computers, and much else around the world. It's also part of a reordering of space and territory globally, with acute effects for lived realities. Fitting for this discussion today, more broadly, I approach this through a discussion of a moment of indiscipline, which we're living, where the invisible is being made visible, and patterns of discipline are destabilized and reordered to move towards a better understanding of how invisibility is now being remade by someone else from a different position globally. Transparency is a buzzword of our times. It's an idea or an ideal that all that is invisible must be made visible. Pushing back against formal political order, this idea implies that the role of government should be minimal. Those who have controlled information historically, who retain the authority to make power and its practices invisible, can and should be unmasked and exposed. In the sights of transparency is the perceived obscured management of power, the inaccessibility of political spheres, and the overreach of zealous states and their police. Transparency is often couched in an intoxicating term that, quote, "sunlight is the best disinfectant." So an explosion of new technologies, from apps on handheld devices to the platforms of prominent social media firms, promise what Larry Diamond of Stanford has called liberation technology. Manuel Castells has argued that new technologies have enabled networks of outrage and hope, underscoring some of the most poignant instances of urban protest in recent times. By providing citizens access to platforms and media that tend to bypass formal political order and other forms of governance, many argue that new technologies promise new forms of contestation and change. Platforms like Facebook and Twitter, of course, pride themselves on accessibility as a foundational pillar. According to them, anyone with an internet connection and access to a computer or a handheld device is in. Moreover, anyone who wants to populate that platform can do so with very few constraints. Any reasonable content is allowed, and especially, they say, content that leads to contestation. More importantly, leaders of these firms have taken vocal public positions against the ever-encroaching state, hinting perceptibly towards a libertarian ideal. But Facebook and other firms have made explicit very publicly how they want to transcend the authority of states. Each of Twitter, Google, and Facebook release periodic transparency reports that detail how much of their content, actually their users' content, was requested by states, how much was provided to them, and in how many instances that data was modified, either deleted or moderated in response to requests. Reports relate how unresponsive these firms are to the requests of states and show which states are especially active in seeking data, leaving the rest up to the reader's imagination and interpretation. But this is, of course, not a subtle way of pointing towards government as a problem and technology as a solution. But Kirsch reminds us that, quote, if life is a product of technological innovation, then it must be seen as an expression of the capitalist imperative behind the process of technological change. This underscores a crucial point. Shifting conditions of capitalism demand both an understanding of the modes of production and accumulation and a critical understanding of the ways that these interests are rewiring social relations and space. The rapid rise of a new global city, the Bay Area of California, which is in fact a city that is not a city, as a nucleus of capital and influence, is one indication of a much larger global shift. This is a shift that, layered on top of neoliberalism, is indicative of a mode of production that pays even less mind to the historic defense of states, bureaucracies, history, culture, and sovereignty to globalizing forces. Technological capitalism, though, shows an acute disinterest in the spaces also created or reinforced as a means to constrain or stem the flow of neoliberal capitalism, places like special economic zones, custom requirements, ports and borders, among other things. Many of today's most dominant companies are, of course, technology firms, especially including companies like Google, Facebook, Apple, Tesla, or LinkedIn. Investors also wait now with bated breath for the IPOs of the next generation of transformative technology firms. These are companies like Uber, Lyft, Airbnb, which actually own little property but have decisive global impacts. More or less non-existent 20 years ago, a great number of today's most powerful firms depend on urban density, cosmopolitanism, and a global fluidity of people and data that was ushered in by neoliberalism. This new push towards transparency as an ideal, of course, contains many assumptions and consequences that obscure the workings and revenue interests of technology platforms, of course. Two, I think, are especially apparent. First, transparency as a solution proposes that more democracy will solve the problems of a perceived lack of democracy. The darkness that sunlight will disinfect is necessarily a political darkness of democracy, and not of a range of other factors and considerations spanning from historic to contemporary, from the legacies of slavery to political pandering, or, of course, capitalism. Second, transparency assumes that all that is invisible and assumed in terms of structural and systemic violence, especially in Latin America, is suitable for discussion and visibility by all publics around the world. Such a proposition, of course, suggests that when we do see these forms of violence, on Facebook or otherwise, and as they've been made invisible by local patterns of governance historically, we will now be willing to see it, to do something about it, and not just to close the computer, to scroll down, or that we become numb to these images. More acutely, the ideal of transparency proposes that when violence comes in ways that twist our moral compass, when a police officer posts his own violence, especially of ideas of who can use violence and who cannot, or that violence should always and necessarily be avoided, that users and new technologies will revisit their own systemic assumptions about what is good. In other words, transparency as a proposition from a place like the Bay Area suggests that if the ugliness of the world gives us reason to shy away from social media platforms, that they become an undesirable place to visit, that those social media platforms will lose users and relevance as a result. Of course, this is far from a likely possibility. No capitalist firm is out to consume itself. Content must be made safe. If transparency is widely espoused and idealized, it only marginally obscures the deeper interests and synergies between governance and capital today. Transparency really as an idea is a sleight of hand, obscuring new but underseen kinds of political authority that are embedded in the control and commodification of data by these new corporations. From 2009 to 2012, I accompanied homicide and other police detectives in the city of Sao Paulo, Brazil. I spent hundreds of hours with police, accompanying them across all matters of their on-duty activities. As ethnographers do, I entered a particular kind of social world and lived reality, complete in this case with its own paradigm of understanding and violence, in this case of very much an everyday idea of survival. In the process, I became friends with police. In technology speak, friends is of course a very flexible term, defined as much by someone's whim to add you, have they ever met you or not, and your willingness or sense of necessity to accept that, or not. It's also, of course, deeply situated in cultural and social tropes. Being a friend or denying friendship means different things in different locations. In Brazil, friendship very much proliferates. Like many social groups, Brazilian police do their own quirky things and do and share quirky things in their lives online. But there is something more about their life online as a representation of their lived experience in the material world. As in the flesh, they navigate, make sense of, and promulgate a social context of urban violence in which they live. That social context includes an ongoing, precarious, and low-level equilibria of everyday violence with an organized crime group known as the Primeiro Comando da Capital, or PCC. I've written, of course, extensively about this circumstance. But now, of course, online and with access to novel platforms, these street-level navigations of police assassinations and police killings are projected in noteworthy ways to unconventional global audiences far from their immediate friends and into new political spheres and possibilities. For police, then, Facebook is very novel. Difficult as it is, the video on my Facebook wall is an empirical example of transparency, at least for a fleeting moment. But this was not just one discrete video, or as Facebook might call it, a data point. It's a video that's replete with context that contains a vital story about historic practices, race, and abandonment in Brazilian cities. Just after I left the field followed me then. In 2013, police began to use and circulate content on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. Under the logic of an ongoing war with organized crime, police unapologetically captured the agony and bloodshed of their everyday practices. And with a touch of a button, they embraced transparency, uploading their world to one managed from afar. Many of the videos of police violence in Brazil, even as taken by police themselves, have created firestorms of public discussion. Political leaders have been forced to respond as citizens have voiced their concerns, often using social media, about how shocking this otherwise normalized violence is. In the video of the young man dying on the street, which I opened with, the governor issued a statement subsequent explaining that this violence was not an official police policy. The statement was deeply revealing, both for its calls for accountability, but also for the ways that it dismissed larger concerns about the necessity of such violence. Noting that the content was unofficial, the statement read, "The military police clarifies that the profile Polícia do Estado de São Paulo on the social media site Facebook, which contains improper content, is not an official page of the institution. For this reason, an investigation into the profile, its content, and its administrators is already apace. With regard to this particular case, Internal Affairs is investigating if military police participated in the shooting and in the capture and sharing of the images, which, if true, may result in the punishment of those responsible." It's important to reiterate that all military police, as any citizen, can post that which they see fit on social networks, being above all held to criminal and administrative account for posts that offend people, institutions, that are against the law, or that are an affront to human dignity. The military police and its subordinate units have their own official profiles that serve as communication channels for the institution. Administrators receive constant direction, and pages are closely monitored. The statement made at least one very clear point. Police violence is not abnormal, nor is it wrong. What's wrong is the visibility of this violence. Not contained within the bureaucratic logics of the police institution, the video shed sunlight on that which is always happening. But the manner in which that light was shed, quite transparently, circumvented the ways that such imageries and practices have been tightly controlled and managed locally by governments and concentrated media interests. More often than not, though, Facebook's response comes to coincide with this one, but for very different reasons. The result is that this urban and social complexity is also pushed out of sight on Facebook. The video of the dying man on the street shot by police generated very much a discussion and reflection, especially from residents of Sao Paulo. I wanted to follow this debate and to see how it played out, both in the comments alongside the images, but also in the traditional media as it picked up the story, which most of the major daily newspapers did. One of the only ways I could track the video of that police shooting, so I could see how much it was being shared and how the comments did evolve, was by sharing it to my own Facebook wall, but redirecting the permissions so that only I could see those imageries. While I also took screenshots, I used this crude method to sort this content so I could come back to it later. I did this with a number of different videos as they became apparent on Facebook, whether they involved things like torture, agony, or police making young men scrape off tattoos, as has become an entire genre. In time, basically all of these images came to be moderated or deleted by Facebook. So the indiscipline generated by transparency and the new visibility of violence is only one very momentary indication of a global reordering of the ability to decide what data matters and who can control it. Even just within the local sphere of policing and violence, this has created larger waves over the accessibility of data by local authorities and its consequences. In March of 2016, Brazilian authorities arrested Facebook's Latin American vice president, the highest level Facebook employee in the region, holding him for days in a Sao Paulo prison. In this case, which was just one of a number of recent clashes between the Brazilian state and technology firms from afar, these authorities charged that Facebook had repeatedly ignored judicial orders to hand over data from WhatsApp, which is a company wholly owned by Facebook. In this particular instance, the data in question related to an ongoing investigation of organized crime, which the authorities alleged had taken refuge in the encrypted global circuits of WhatsApp. This new pattern of communication, far outside the reach of local investigators, has given organized crime groups the upper hand, giving them new visibility and shielding them from the historic patterns of investigation, and even enabling them to communicate more safely. Wiretaps of telephone lines, which have long been a staple of investigation, for better or worse, of course, they've become nearly useless as sources of data or intelligence. New technologies like WhatsApp, which is a company that has 0 staff in Brazil but is used by more than 100 million Brazilians, dramatically curtails the Brazilian state's historic ability to watch, monitor, and at least keep tabs on organized crime. Of course, there's a whole other story going on there. Where it has become impossible to capture data produced locally but circulating globally, detaining people in physical jurisdictions within states remains one of the only options left. Or so it's understood. In the last 2 years, Brazilian authorities have shut down WhatsApp nationally 3 times for periods of days at each time. And in each of the cases, the reason has been a refusal by WhatsApp to release data pertinent to investigations about organized crime, which police themselves argue will lead to more violence and to more assassinations of them, which happens, of course, by the hundreds every single year. And, of course, their worry is it will lead to greater long-term insecurity. For their part, though, WhatsApp argues that all of this data is encrypted, and it itself does not have access to the data on that platform. At the same time, though, many prominent voices actively decry the ways that the Brazilian state is responding to this new pattern of data as commodity. Observers argue that government efforts to maintain some semblance of authority or access to data by attempting to hold companies to account, arresting Facebook executives, or through the creation of new national legislation, amount basically to new efforts at surveillance and counterinsurgency. But really this is kind of beside the point. Riding upon a wave of technological solutionism and political libertarianism, such observers tend to sidestep the creeping influences and capitalist futures of gigantic technology firms, which come across as very benign and apolitical. Faced with an assumed choice, many liberal elites tend to allocate more trust in corporations than they do in government. This is even, of course, as little know how far their own data is being used and their privacy is being reshaped by those exact same capitalist interests. Few know, for example, that both Google and Facebook capture and store personal data by their apps and devices, including through capture of ambient audio recordings, location history of users, and stored history of viewed internet sites. Your history and words, as mine, are very much online. New technologies, then, have opened up a vast sphere of possibilities for interaction for many people. Few could argue that Brazil's most recent moment of political protest and counter-protest was not definitively shaped by the synergies between technology use and everyday life today. Manuel Castells has argued that social networks are boundless by definition. But this cannot be said for online iterations of social networks. These spheres are not themselves apolitical, and they thus increasingly shape what is seen, by whom and where, whether by algorithm or human moderation. We really don't know. How these delineations matter empirically in Latin America is increasingly obvious and patterned under a reordered kind of discipline that is becoming more obvious after a moment of indiscipline. But what the medium and long-term consequences are, either as they relate to policing and organized crime or to political mobilization and protest, very much remains to be seen. Thank you.